Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Sequence, curated by Christine DePiro-Abbott. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Art Werger. As a brief reminder, everyone tuned in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to use that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Art.
Thank you and welcome. I want to thank everyone for being here to listen to my talk. I hope it might give you some new ways of thinking about images and image making. And I want to thank Kat and the crew at the Rife Gallery and Christine for organizing this showcase of printmaking in Ohio. A wonderful exhibit, great to be included with everyone. I've titled this talk Windows and Mirrors in order to introduce a couple of the key concepts that I've gathered from some 55 years of making images and teaching. The concepts I'll be talking about are primarily based in the kind of imagery that I create, which is observational, representational imagery, presenting subjects that are recognizable as reflections of our worldly experience. So as a basic introduction, we tend to think of pictorial imagery and of the picture plane as being a rectangular pane of glass on the wall. This can take the form of either a window, revealing an outer world, or a mirror reflecting ourselves. Windows reveal a three-dimensional encompassing space. They invite us into a world with many layers of depth and meaning. A window is an invitation to share an experience over time, with rewards that can increase due to the amount of time invested. Here in this example, we have Peter Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow. We're presented with many layers of information, entering the picture from the left with a group of hunters returning from a day's unproductive outing. The harsh, high contrast values convey the frigid cold and the bitterness of life in a foreign land in an otherwise forgotten age. This is life in Holland during the Little Ice Age of the 1500s. In the distance, we're shown a fantastic, jagged mountainscape that doesn't really exist in either Holland or Belgium. It seems to act more as a compositional border to pull our attention back into the image and circle through it again. This movement throughout the composition, throughout the picture plane, is one of the interesting aspects of the window. The window opens us up to the world. Mirrors, on the other hand, reflect who we are. They're confrontational and introspective. They tend to have a strong singular focal point, shallow space, and are most often centered. In this Rembrandt self-portrait, we see not only what he looked like, but we seem to see into his soul. We see the doubt and insecurity brought on by late middle age during the artist's declining career. In this mirror, we share the intimate honesty in the presence of the great artist. Some 350 years after his death, when we view this painting in person, we're standing in his position, arm's length from the canvas, and we share that privileged position of genius. So mirrors reflect the personality and presence of their subjects. But in a broad way, we can think about windows and mirrors this way. Windows show us the world, mirrors show us ourselves. They're exterior and interior. In the contemporary art world, image making has become dominated by the mirror approach because of championing by artists such as Andy Warhol, Chuck Close, Cindy Sherman, Kehinde Wiley. The subject is front and center, usually looking directly back at the viewer. The background is non-existent or portrays an extremely shallow space. Notice how Wiley cleverly lets the background overlap the foreground subject. This approach presents a confrontational subject and is immediately understood. But the straightforward message is also a bit of a closed loop. It tells us what we already know. So in my definition, the concept of the mirror approach need not be a portrait, but can be an image of any singular object or subject centered with a minimal background. meant to be taken in quickly. In teaching art, I found that a natural tendency to depict subjects in the center of the page. Backgrounds, when considered at all, are an afterthought, usually a pattern space to fill the unused pictorial background. Makes sense. Young artists are often exploring identity, trying to figure out who they are. And social media and our ever-present smartphone reinforces the process of self-reflection. Our social media feeds all tell us what we already know. This is the way mirrors work. The image in the mirror may be straightforward, heartfelt, insightful, and engaging, but it can also be limited in its expressive range. At some point, the artist must look outward. Learning to observe and interpret the landscape and space of the external world tends to be a more challenging concept. Vague understanding of perspective and depth often lead to a disconnect between what is observed and what is depicted. And this kind of observation is often abandoned for symbolism and overly simplistic depictions in which the artist's physical location is undetermined. For students, this can lead to frustration and to a return of the comfort of the mirror. In many exhibitions, I find that the artist's approach tends to be the mirror about 90% of the time and maybe 10% windows. My mother was a watercolor artist, and her preferred motif was the landscape. So she taught me how to depict nature, how to depict space and light. She would take me out to observe and paint from life. I learned so much from her, but her rather bucolic escape approach seemed to me an unrealistic vision. Growing up in New Jersey, this was not the kind of scene we saw out of our backyard. So when I decided to become an artist, I found that I wanted to find ways of challenging both the basic mirror and window formats. As I said, my mother taught me art. I don't remember learning certain things. Like here, she said, paint the trees by painting the dark around the trees, paint the negative shade. I don't remember learning perspective. My mother just said, see how those people get smaller as they walk away from us? That's perspective. So I love to challenge students to observe the world around them in new ways. In this case, I presented a rather impossible project to a beginning drawing class. I said, assume a specific position in the room, and from there, draw everything in the room, including yourselves drawing the room. The results were eye-opening, challenging, and mind-changing. I decided early on that I wanted to be a representational artist, but I was met by challenges. When I went to art school at the Rhode Island School of Design, I found that I had to justify making representational work. Hadn't it all been done before? And so I found ways to challenge the conventions of picture making, to challenge both the mirror and the window. So here we are, the Werger family in 1962. The image is presented in a typical photographic mirror where we see staged personas, smiling faces, looking at the lens, and hiding any complexity. The camera lens has become our primary mirror through which we tell our stories. And this is where I'll start my story. I was born in suburban New Jersey in 1955 in what would today be described as a typical nuclear family. I came of age with rock and roll, television, and comic books. I had trouble separating my life from the lives in sitcoms, and have had trouble separating the myths presented through television from reality. I was aware of my privilege from an early age, being born at the time I was, in the place I was, 30 miles safely outside of New York City. As the only boy in the family, I was spoiled, never wanting for attention, food, shelter, love, or anything else you could imagine. I was born in a time of peace and prosperity. I was born a boomer. As I mentioned, my mother, Adelaide, was trained as an artist. She studied fashion illustration, but then went to work during World War II. Eventually, she ended up painting crosshairs on Norden bomb sites with a single hair brush. My father became a CPA, an accountant who worked for an Italian family business. After the war, my parents wanted to have a family, but had trouble conceiving. They eventually adopted my older sister, Sue, and then a couple years later, found that I was belatedly on the way. I was soon followed by my younger sister, Patty. So here's a painting my mother made of me when I was 26 months old. I was called by my middle name, Larry, growing up because my father was Art. And I'll still answer to Larry if it's delivered in a New Jersey accent. It's funny how certain things have an indelible impression. I can still remember the taste of the head of this hobby horse, the hard plastic of it. So in spite of all my privileges, I was a loner. I was moody. I was prone to introspection and was largely friendless. Life was not without its anxieties either. I knew my father had served in World War II. My grandfather had served in World War I. I just assumed that I would serve in World War III. We were trained to hide under our desks in case of a nuclear war, and I was anxious about everything. When my younger sister, who was also my closest friend, died of leukemia, I retreated further inward into a depressed period of time, shutting out the outer world. I didn't speak for weeks at a time. I found words to be totally meaningless, and I learned to express myself through making pictures. I started drawing, mostly making portraits, mirrors, so that I could express my emotions. I drew for hours every day, establishing a practice that I've continued to this day. My early portraits were my mirrors, whether they me or somebody else, they were reflecting my feelings and thoughts. Portraits of others and my self through reflection. As with most mirrors, they were centered, and the background was an afterthought. My preferred medium was scratchboard, an ink-coated chalk paper. So when the black ink is scratched away, white is revealed underneath, going from dark to light using a needle. This is where I learned some of the techniques that I continue to this day with etching. When I turned to the window format, I decided to challenge the picture plane beyond its comfortable small format. It's not just a typical window on the wall, so I'd often expand it into a wide angle, 180 degree, or even a 360 degree panoramic image. I'd often include the appendages of my own body in order to create a first-person subjective presentation of the landscape. I was saying this is how I experienced the world. My parents always made sure I had the best education possible. They funded my way through RISD and through grad school at the University of Wisconsin. In my artwork, I wanted to challenge realistic conventions. I was interested in how I saw things and how other people would share that experience. Can I put you in my position? And how can I make representational images that are engaging and challenging for us to look at in new ways? My images often assumed an aerial vantage point, to think about the window differently. It's not just a window where you're looking out at the horizon line as a destination, but to hover above something. This gives the viewer the perspective of the omniscient narrator, seeing all and understanding all around them. These images are windows, but the aerial vantage point takes the glass plane off the wall and places it perhaps on the floor. One reason that this was relevant for me was because I don't work on a canvas with a vertical window, but rather on a copper etching plate placed on a tabletop. So I'm looking down on that surface as I draw, and I want you to fall into the story. Etching has been my medium of choice for over 40 years now. I love the graphic linear qualities of etching, the process of working through stages. I love the drawing techniques, the production, and mostly the surprising reveal when the paper is pulled from the plate. So you might work on something for a long time before you see the result of it. One other very formative experience occurred right after my younger sister's death. I was about 13 at the time, and I was walking with my parents along a rocky coast in Massachusetts. I slipped off the rocky cliff into the ocean. The tide was causing me to rise and fall about 10 feet with each wave. I grabbed at the rocks only to scrape my hands raw with the barnacles. And then somehow appearing from nowhere, my mother's arm reached out and pulled me up. I don't know how she got there so quickly. My biggest reaction was utter embarrassment. So I often deal with my fears and anxieties in the things I choose to draw. I often choose a somewhat precarious perch when drawing to challenge my anxieties and to take control of my fears. Along with my fear of heights, I have a fear of drowning. So I suppose everyone does. The Beneath the Surface title here in this two-panel etching is a reference to the etching process itself, a printmaking technique in which the image is held in the recesses of the metal plate and the surface is wiped clean. Another influence that I must acknowledge is my love of film noir, and specifically of Alfred Hitchcock. And so here we see a calm neighborhood, and there's a confrontation playing out under a streetlight. It's like there's an unwelcome visitor in the neighborhood, and the neighbors are either coming to break up this fight or to escalate the situation. We don't know. So I enjoy playing with the narrative possibilities of a still image. What happened before this? What will happen afterwards? That has to happen in the mind of the viewer. So how can I bring the viewer into an active relationship with the information that I present in a still picture? In continuing to explore the possibilities of narrative, I began to work in mezzotint, which is the oldest medium used to reproduce full tonal images. Again, working on a copper plate and going from black to white, I started a sequence of square images derived from everyday experiences. The squares are like days on a calendar, and I try to make one every day when I'm working on these series. The gutter in between the image is a raised surface reaching out towards the viewer. I think of this as a concept that Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics emphasized in how the gutter between images is where the viewer's involvement comes in. The viewer must determine what happens from one image to the next. Is it a before and after? Is it a non sequitur? Is it a zoom in? What is the relationship between those two images, and how does that become a narrative? So in these grid pieces, I am not only working from left to right, but up and down and sideways, and letting each image influence the others. So to date, I've made over 500 mezzotints. I claim that's more than any other artist has ever made. Carol Wax, who wrote the book on mezzotint, said 500 was about the most ever made. And one of the advantages of printmaking is that I can create these copper plates with the image on them, and then I can ink them up and print them in multiple formats. I can print them all on one page, as we saw previously, or in individual pages, individual sheets of paper. And I can also try to disseminate them as much as possible. So rarely does anyone come to my studio and leave without a little print to keep their interest, to start their print collection. On occasion, I'll also exhibit the actual copper plates, which acquire a range of patinas through the process of repeated printing. They can only be viewed when the light hits them at the right angle. So they kind of come to life as you're moving around and the light reflects off them in different ways. This is another way to bring the element of time and movement into the still image. So mezzotint has also allowed me to explore other narrative directions. When working on a copper plate, you can only see what you're doing as the lighting illuminates the image. And I noticed that I could start to weave two images together on a single plate. When working on the plate under directional lighting, it almost appears like a hologram. One image fades and the other one appears. This concept has allowed me to simultaneously explore the mirror and the window in the same piece. And for me, this implies memory. Memory not just being the thing that happened a long time ago, but the juxtaposition of the present trigger, which stirs up that past moment, with activating some previous incident. So these double exposures look outward and inward simultaneously. In another place, I've depicted my wife, Carla Hackenmiller, deep in thought. She is, like me, prone to deep introspection. At times, I wonder where she goes when she's so deep in thought. Hypnagogia in the exhibit is a state of transitional consciousness between being awake and asleep. And here it's emphasized by the vertical and horizontal elements in the composition. I often find that my most creative ideas come at these moments when I'm not focusing directly on the problem at hand and allow my mind to wander off into sleep. The act of forgetting deals with the internal and external once again as a metaphor for memory. And with age, I find concrete concepts often dissolve into fluid and can no longer be summoned up when demanded. Clarity, also in the exhibit, is a dream in which everything makes sense. In this piece, I'm assuming an impossible vantage point in a fleeting moment and then spending a year working on the copper plate. Thinking, what is it like to see through the eyes of a seagull, exploring the water surface for food? What is it like to transcend our human existence and see the world as other species see it? I still spend a lot of time drawing in plein air or on site. These are drawings on black paper, which I made last year at this time out in Montauk on the tip of Long Island, known as the End. And I've been observing and depicting the erosion on the coast here for the last 15 years. While obviously these are landscapes or windows, I think of these things as being portraits of old friends, looking at these shapes of overhangs and hoodoos, depicting these characters as they blend the concept of mirror and window. Every year, the faces change. There's more crags, or sometimes they're smoothed out. Sometimes there's noticeable changes just in a couple months. I try to draw as realistically as I can. I feel like I'm documenting as I'm doing these drawings, but there's a lot of leeway in the depiction as well. So it's not just a photograph. Photographs don't have the same resonance for me. Requiem here, another mezzotint, is another year-long project, a landscape of impenetrable space depicting one of my favorite places on Point Lobos in Carmel, California. This was made as my father was dying of cancer, and I found I had to dive deep into a project to occupy my times and control my emotional state. Throughout the process of working on this mezzotint, I was thinking of Michelangelo. I was thinking of Last Judgment. I was thinking about how Michelangelo carved David. You know, the old joke about how did he carve David? Well, he carved away everything that wasn't David. And I felt like on a very shallow level, I was carving into this copper plate. And so those concepts were in my mind constantly. And then at some point, I started to carve figures, looking at the engravings of Gustave Doré, I was carving these monumental classical figures into the rock. I don't know if you can see them. Let me show a little close up here, and maybe you can start to see these figures struggling to pull themselves out of this uninhabitable landscape. So there's over 100 figures. I'll go back. I don't know if you can contextualize them a little bit better here, but there's over 100 figures pulling out of this rock space. And again, thinking about the traditional window of a landscape, this is a landscape which is all up against the surface. So you don't have the opportunity to go into any deep space. You don't have the opportunity to walk down a receding perspective trail towards the horizon. It all comes right back to the surface of the picture. Rising tide is meant as a metaphor for time and eternity. The copper plate here, mesotent plate, was worked for about a year, once again, as details were built into the hole. And so for minutes, hours, days, weeks, the process becomes a meditation for me. So I taught at Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia from 1982 until 2000, and then moved to Ohio University in Athens and taught there until 2020. And just as I was retiring, I was given the opportunity to illustrate Mario Puzo's classic book, The Godfather. It was a very important book to my generation with its themes of immigrants in New York City and what we now call toxic masculinity. The book was often carried around by my classmates in high school. I thought they were carrying around a Bible, and then I realized, no, it's not that black book was not the Bible, it was The Godfather. And so when presented with this opportunity to illustrate The Godfather, I wanted to do it again in aquatints and mesotints. And ultimately ended up with 16 illustrations for the story. My approach was to start with windows to invite us into the place. So here's New York in Times Square in the 1940s. In this way, it's a mirror. We have a figure who's center and looking right back at us, so it could be a mirror. But there's no face to enlighten us. There's no likeness to tell us about it. Instead, we have to resort to the location. And again, film noir and that kind of narrative presentation. It was a lot of fun to think back of what was Times Square like when I was a kid. Well, I remember this Camel cigarette billboard with actual smoke coming out of it. And so I did as much research as I could in looking back at the presentation of not just Times Square, but Times Square of a certain era. And then in contrast to that, to depict Las Vegas for the latter part of the narrative of The Godfather, think about how is the sky different in Las Vegas? How are the signs different? How do you create a different mood, a different feeling for that location than for New York? So these windows, again, are to pull us into this place. Then to get involved in the narrative, trying to find ways to let the story tell itself over time. So hoping that you might see the main characters first and their dual sort of vertical white of the spaghetti and the napkin that they're holding up to their mouths, and then only afterwards to see the border element of the character of Michael Corleone coming in with a gun, which is to seal their fate. So there's lots of little things in trying to illustrate the book, which is different than the movie. If you're familiar with the movie, that was not what I was illustrating. I was illustrating the original text, going back to and trying to reinvent those characters. So here, Sonny Corleone is not James Caan, but somebody who has the characteristics of being arrogant and powerful. And in this case, in his final scene, oblivious, blindsided, oblivious to the ambush which is taking place behind and in front of him. And perhaps the most famous scene in that narrative is one that involves a horse's head. Here, perhaps a little bit more subtle and evocative than the graphic horror scene that Francis Ford Coppola turned it into in his movie version. And again, trying to create like the highlight of the figure in the painting as perhaps a first highlight, then the secondary highlight being the repeated angle of the sleeping character's arms, and then hopefully the horse's head shadow being a little bit more subtle and being noticed after the fact, even if just slightly. And in only this last image did I use the mirror concept, where we see Michael Corleone now fully realized as the new godfather of the family. And so it's not Al Pacino, but it's got to be Michael, and it's got to have that look and that arrogance and that angle to convey so many different things in this narrative story. So I've been talking about concepts. I've been talking about imagery. I've been talking about what I want people to see. And I think that's always the primary motive of artists, that you want artists to look at the work and respond to it. However, with printmaking, there's always this thought right away, well, how is that made? And I hope that's not a barrier to appreciating the work in front of you. But inevitably, how is the image made? So I'm going to show a sequence here of how I work on a two-panel image, which is two large beach scenes on copper plates. Each one is 24 by 30 in size. And I am working in the medium of aquatint. My approach in aquatint is to try to create the whole image in this one process. And so the first time I print it is the end result. That's a very challenging approach, which I don't recommend for beginners, but I've really come to enjoy as a challenge to myself. So what I'm doing is putting a very fine powder of rosin onto the surface of the copper plate and melting it onto the surface, and using that very fine powder of rosin that works like a halftone sort of. It creates light gray or dark gray or black dots, depending on how long that copper plate is left in the acid. And I will draw on the plate and then put it in the acid and then let it dry, and I'll draw some more and I'll put it back in the acid and let it dry and draw some more and put it back in the acid. So I will work on the plates, in this case, for about 6 weeks before I see the end result. And the things I'm working with are acid-resistant drawing materials. I'm working with something called a white ground here. So where you see white, solid white, that is not going to let any acid in, and that's going to stay white. So here, white is white. But I'm also going to start, if you look off to the left, I'll start drawing with black crayons. And so there, where I'm drawing, looks black in coloration. But the important thing to realize is that black or white, both of these are resists. Both of these are acid resists. So both of those areas will be lighter, and where the copper is left open, that is where the plate will gradually darken. So this is a photograph of the two plates, slightly skewed, but the two plates, the first time they went into the acid for about a minute, very short amount of time. Then the second time, you can see there's a lot more drawing with the black litho crayons, the grease pencils, and that area will be a lighter gray, but not white. And so that's the second time the plates go in the acid after about another 3 or 4 days of drawing. And then the third time, now I'm drawing quite a bit with litho crayons. Third time in the acid, probably another week, week and a half of drawing before getting to this stage. And continuing on with the process, I think this had 6 or 7 stages altogether. Now we're getting towards the end. You can still see some of the brownish or copper, which is revealed to the acid. These are now dark areas. Everything that is or was white with white ground, or black with lithocrayon, or black with liquid asphaltum, or blue with Sharpie markers, all of these things are acid blockouts. And so those areas will not get darker, only the copper gets darker. And now we're approaching the very end. This is, I think, the next to last stage. This is all dark gray. And I've done this enough that I can visualize what it's going to look like. I just try to make the plate look interesting, the surface look resolved each time I put the plates back in the acid. And this is the very last time. So now the only areas which are still revealed are solid black. At that point, the plates have been in the acid for a combined total of maybe an hour or so. At that point, I take the plates out of the acid and clean off all these layers of resist with mineral spirits and asphalt, or mineral spirits and denatured alcohol. Put ink into the plate, wipe the surface of the plate clean, and then print it. And that's the result. And so all of that work, all of that time is an abstract process. And then when I finally print the piece, I feel like, you know, to some degree, I'm responsible for this work, but on the other hand, it's kind of spiritual. It comes from somewhere else. And when it works, it's a kind of a magical thing to have it all appear at once. And that is, I think, the last slide. It's finishing up a little bit early, which allows for some time for questions, if anybody has any.
We have a couple of questions, but I'd like to start particularly because we just ended on process. So there's some real relationship between understanding composition in reverse and in negative. And so I'm curious, are you creating images and creating negatives then that you work from, or are you so practiced that you already know it and can work automatically through your head and into your hands? Just curious
Yeah,
if you could talk a bit about that.
I've been doing it for, yeah, like I said, 50 years. So I internalize it pretty much at this point. But for students, when I'm showing them how to do the aquative process, I'll tell them whatever they're working from to bring it into Photoshop and invert it and then change the layers or the levels so that they can just see the highlights. And that's what they would draw the first time. And then gradually just see the very dark areas. And that's what they'd be aiming for the second time. I tried doing that once and found it not very pleasing because my own interpretation of that processing, I think, is part of it.
So you are really well known for your mesotints. However, you
Mhm.
did not chat through the process of that. And while you did mention that, you know, it's one of the, if not the oldest, full value multiple image
Mhm.
rendition that is known within art history, for folks that are not deeply invested in print culture, they may not understand what a mezzotint means and the amount of
No.
work that it takes. So could you just give us kind of uh, outline of what that entails?
Absolutely. And I do have my website up here, and within my website, I have a lot of process videos and educational videos. And so if if you really want to my in-depth demo, I've got a 3 video sequence on how to make a mezzotint, which is probably a lot more information than any of you would want. There's also a short video, which is on the making of the made man, which is the first image that I showed for the Godfather series. So there are videos there which will go into it in great depth. What I like to say about mezzotint when I'm doing workshops and teaching the process is that it seems very complicated and very confusing, but what it is basically is you make it rough, you make it smooth. You take a copper plate and you make it rough and that holds ink, and then you make it smooth and that prints as white or light or gray if you don't make it that smooth. The process is involving a rocker, which is a tool that has teeth on it and rocks back and forth into the surface of the plate, creating small divots, like 100 teeth per inch, and creates divots into the copper plate. You do that in 100 different directions, and the entire copper plate is pitted so that it holds ink. And only at that point, when you cannot see any more reflection off the surface of the copper, then you can go in and with a scraper or burnisher start to work the surface of the plate. So yeah, for years and years, I rocked all my own plates. And that's why I have bad elbows now and bad shoulders. But actually, they make pretty good pre-rock plates now that you can purchase at a good price and avoid that laborious part of it. That said, I like to do them quick. Like I said, I was doing one every day. Small, like 3 inches square, but I was doing one every day. And I'd like to try to demystify the process and take the need for it to be such a time-consuming medium out of it so that you can be more fully expressive and more immediately expressive with it. So again, on my website there at artwerger.com are in-depth mezzotint demos if you want to take a look at those.
Great. So teaching is an important piece of your process as well. Curious, what is the most valuable thing a student or a class has taught to you?
Has taught me. It teaches me all the time. Teaches me the importance of the basics, like teaching beginning drawing and teaching it for 40 years. Every time I would go through those beginning exercises, I would relearn them, and I'd go back into the studio and realize that I needed to focus on those concepts myself. Focus on the negative shape, focus on the strength of the composition, focus on the way the light illuminates and tells the story. So yeah, all of those concepts are really important in my process as well. And the other thing which has been so important in teaching is realizing that other students don't have my background and don't have my privilege and don't approach things the same way. So while I mentioned I didn't have to really learn perspective, I was, it was ingrained in me. I found that teaching perspective, I have to have 10 different ways of going about it laterally so that I can help students to be comfortable observing and depicting what they see. And that's quite often a challenge. And I've gradually over time, if I'm teaching perspective, I'll have laser pointers and saying, well, there's the vanishing point right there from your position, and this is the angle you're looking for, but not just telling someone how to do it, but helping them to see how to do it and when to use it, when to use linear perspective and when to abandon it and do more creative things.
So you mentioned that you began working with portraits, and most folks do, and backgrounds were afterthoughts. How did you learn or train yourself to add backgrounds into your portraits, and or what was the kind of turning point that helped you get to a place of that kind of crossover, that importance of crossover within your work?
I think it was the first week at RISD where they gave us an assignment and I was very uptight and drew some little dinky thing in the middle of the page, and they just said, "Oh, this is horrible." and it took a while for me to realize that, yeah, I had some rendering skill, but yeah, it was horrible in terms of how it took control. It didn't take control of the picture plane at all. So learning the importance of composition was vital for me, and is something that I approach images with all the time. Start and be working in printmaking. Also, you've got to have everything located where you want it right off the bat before you start on the plate. So in a painting, you can paint something here and then you can decide, oh no, it needs to be over there. You can't do that with printmaking. If you put it here and then you realize, oh, it should have been over there, you got to start over. So that's something that I learned to prioritize as one of the most important things to think about from the beginning.
Great. Were you introduced to Mezzotint at RISD, or is that something you discovered on your own?
It was something that I had seen and loved the look of. And so I asked at RISD, how do you do this mezzotint thing? And they said, there's a rocker in the back of the studio. It's not sharp and you shouldn't do it. And then I went to Wisconsin, another of the top printmaking schools in the country. And I'd like to try mezzotint. How do you do mezzotint? There's a rocker in the back of the studio. Nobody's ever used it. And you shouldn't do that. It's too slow. And so I never did mezzotint until I had been teaching for a few years. And I was teaching a beginning printmaking class. And on a whim, I came in with a plate that I had rocked and just told my students, well, you're working today, but I've got this demo I'm going to do here. I've got this plate, this process called mezzotint. I'm just going to start scraping and burnishing. And I had a photograph from Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. And so I started drawing this image from Rear Window. And I worked on it for about 40 minutes and I proofed it. And it was starting to look like something. And I worked a little while longer and printed it. And by the end of that class, I had a finished image. I had never done a demo which resulted in a finished image. And so I thought, well, this is not necessarily a slow medium. This could be a fast medium. This could be a spontaneous medium. And that's what led me into trying to do one every day. Doing one every day allowed me to rethink the kinds of images I was making too, because I didn't have to make something that took a year and had to be a grand metaphor for all of our experiences in life. It was just a toss-up. It was a one-day thing. It could be a transitional scene, getting from here to there. Didn't have to be monumental. And then that day's image would lead to the next day's image and the next. So it really freed up my thinking about individual images and about connections between them in a sort of an animated way. So I'm meandering, but I hope that answers your question.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. And maybe this will be the last question, and it's likely to meander as well. Why printmaking, and why is printmaking an important component of the art sphere?
Yeah, it's a thing which I've asked frequently of myself and others. And so coming from my experiences working with, pointed pencils and working with scratchboard and working from black to white, loving to work with charcoal drawing, going from dark to light, those sorts of processes, which I think of, starting with a dark room and illuminating. Illuminating is telling the story. Those things led me into printmaking, but there's also the look of it. And so and this goes back to an early age, my mother would bring us into the city, and we'd go to the Met and we'd go to the Modern. And so I was sort of raised on pop art, on silkscreen printing, and the graphic qualities of that, the graphic sensibilities of that. But also, I just loved the etchings and lithographs that I would see in the museums, to the point where I'd walk into a room and I'd go to that little tiny black and white etching across the room, and I wouldn't see, the bigger things, the sculptures in the middle of the room, the paintings. I was just drawn to that look. There's something about that look that, for me, communicated in a different way and resonated in a different way. And so it was following that goal of trying to make work that looked like that. I worked in illustration as an undergrad. I was in illustration for a while and didn't really take to it. I didn't really find my muse in illustration, but in printmaking, it just resonated. It is a difficult medium to work in because of that thing I mentioned earlier, that everybody looks at it and says, well, how is this done? And you don't want to have to explain, well, how was this done over and over? Because without seeing the process, you can be talking and you can explain how it's done, and you just see people's eyes go into a dull stare that they don't understand what you're saying. They can't unless you see it. So if you see the processes, then you can start to comprehend them. But if you can circumvent that and just look at the images and respond to that, I think that's the importance of these graphic media and what makes them so powerful. There's also the intimacy of it. So we work with a false paradigm of making prints, which we then put on the wall to critique like they were paintings, rather than making prints and handing them around and having each individual hold them and look at them and have that one-on-one experience that is so important. More like a book illustration, perhaps, than the window of the painting on the wall. So when you see paintings on the wall and you see prints on the wall, well, the paintings communicate better from a distance, colorful. The prints are not as powerful in that context. And so printmaking tends not to have the respect for that and other reasons that painting has. But for those of us who are attracted to printmaking, there's nothing like it. And so printmakers are wonderfully dedicated artists and love to share what they're doing. So any technique, any process, anything I've learned, I just want to say, hey, somebody else can do this. Make sure that the art form lives on and isn't interrupted.
That's great. There's also the additional quality that, printmaking often does not reveal just one piece, right? It allows for additions. And so there's this,
Right.
This ability to have your work in many hands and it makes it a little more accessible, which is also really lovely.
And as the creator, I feel like because I'm working in printmaking, I need to give each piece the time that it wants. And if it takes a year, that's fine. I'll have an additional 25 at the end of that year. Rather than spending a year on one painting, I would never want to part with it. So there's that preciousness of the unique work of art, which is part of its appeal, that you can own that piece and nobody else can. But with printmaking, they're originals. They're printed by the artist. They're originals. but you can get them for a more reasonable price because they are not unique. There's more than one in most cases. A lot of people, though, use the process and just make one or a couple because they love the process that much. The multiple is not that important part of it.
The great thing about art, so many people can do it in such different ways. So thank you again, Art.
Evidenced by the exhibit, yes.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you again, Art, for the generosity of your time and talent. And thanks everyone for joining us for this artist talk by Art Werger as a part of our programming for Sequence. Special thank you to curator Christine DePiro Abbott, and a big thank you to all the other participating artists. Of course, the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.